Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be able to talk to all of you about this, how we use R at Pew Research Center. So to sort of start off, I'll just kind of give a quick overview of what Pew Research Center is. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization here in DC, and our research really spans a whole bunch of different fields, including politics, journalism, social trends. You can read all of them for yourself if you want to. And we study these topics using a variety of approaches. So commonly we'll use survey data. We have a very large panel of Americans who take surveys on a monthly basis. We also use administrative data like census data pretty frequently. But my team, which is called the Data Labs team, focuses on newly available kinds of data, and often that's social media data. So what do I mean by new kinds of data? Well, when we use the internet, we're all creating lots of data, behavioral traces, trails of what we're up to. And you know, sometimes that's intentional, sometimes not. But some websites increasingly are making that data available to researchers. So Twitter has an API, the next presentation is about that. YouTube has an API. And you know, that's great, but the data you get from websites is often super messy. It's not very representative. It's hard to interpret. You know, if you do a keyword search on Twitter for COVID-19, you'll get a lot of tweets, but what does it actually mean? It's often really hard to sort of make that jump. So I think there's a lot of good news too, primarily relying on existing research to provide sort of models for how to analyze social media data in a way that is rigorous and that generates findings that are both important and generalizable. And so new tools like R and Python are really important because they're allowing people to take that messy data and put it in better shape pretty quickly and really analyze it in ways that would be super hard if you were sort of back in the old days of proprietary statistical packages that were really focused on surveys and things like that. And the other thing that's nice about R and Python is we can all contribute to the broader research community pretty easily. And yet, you know, you can do this with Stata, I guess, as well. But I think there's a really nice culture of collaboration, especially in the R world. And to try and contribute, actually, Pew Research Center open sourced our first package on Thursday of last week, and it's called Pew Methods. There's a picture of the GitHub repo. If you analyze surveys at all, I strongly recommend checking out this package. It's got a lot of nice stuff, and I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of the talk. So in the talk today, I'm going to cover two studies that my team has done, and there's a theme that connects them. The theme is that there are virtues of constraint when studying social media, and these virtues are important. So I'm going to argue that we should be intentionally limiting ourselves when we're studying something like social media. And one way to do that is to choose an important set of users or a particular kind of content that you're interested in. Don't just try and do everything because very quickly things will get out of hand. And by choosing some constraints, you're going to be able to manage your data more easily, and your research design is going to be a little bit stronger in most cases. So I'll sort of give examples of constraints as I talk through these two examples. All right, so what are these two projects? The first one is going to focus on members of the US Congress and how they use Facebook to communicate with constituents. The second one is going to be the one that links a survey with some social media data, and it's going to focus on how Americans tweet about politics. So those are the two main topics. All right, so politics on Facebook. We're going to start by introducing a pretty big constraint, which is we're only going to care about a small population of users. Why do we want to do that? Well, if we try and collect Facebook user data, we're going to run into problems really quickly. You know, there used to be a Facebook API that was publicly available that let you at least gather content from public groups. That no longer exists. And you know, most users on Facebook have private accounts. So it's really hard to study the average American on Facebook. But for members of Congress, we can identify all of them pretty easily. I mean, it actually still takes some work because members of Congress have official accounts, and then they have campaign accounts, sometimes they have personal accounts, but we can identify all of their accounts in a matter of days. And that's going to avoid bias because then whatever we say something to characterize members of Congress on Facebook, we really have coverage of the entire population, which is great. We also think that what members of Congress say is consequential. They're unlike a typical user to the extent that oftentimes members of Congress will announce policy decisions on social media. So we think they're probably worth studying. And the other cool thing about social media is you can always observe how online audiences react to what people say. So we're going to focus in on two of the measures that we built for this project. There's more in a report that's available at pewresearch.org. But the first measure is going to be how often do members of Congress express disagreement or opposition to those on the other side of the aisle. And so for Democrats, that'll be Republicans and President Trump. For Republicans, it's going to be Democrats and President Obama when he was in office. And then we're also going to briefly touch on how often members of Congress discuss local issues. Okay, so to answer these questions, we're going to gather all congressional Facebook posts from 3 years, January 2015 to December 2017. It's quite a lot of posts, over 700,000. And then we're going to use some human labor to evaluate a sample of them. And this sample of 11,000 posts, we're going to say, did this post express opposition to those in the other party? Or did this post mention local politics or not? And then we're going to train a model. We're going to use a support vector machine model to classify all of the remaining posts based on those 11,000. And there's a lot more detail about these steps in the methodology to this report. But you know, one sort of interesting thing to note is when you're studying something that's relatively rare, you can kind of oversample cases that are likely to contain that concept, and then you don't have to code quite so many, but 11,000, I guess, is still a lot. Okay, so here's an example of a congressional Facebook page, Rep. Pete Aguilar. And basically what we're gonna do is using the API, we're gonna find all the posts. Here's an example of a post from this representative. And it looks like this post is sort of expressing some opposition to Republicans. It says by selling out the middle class to make room for tax cuts for the rich, the Republican tax plan does just the opposite of the good thing above. So this would probably be classified as an example of opposition. But the cool thing about the social media posts is that you also get all this engagement, right? So we've got a bunch of people liking the post, 9 shares, we've got a bunch of comments on the post. And so with the Facebook API, we're going to be able to collect some of those statistics. So basically, this is what it looks like in our studio. The name of the representative, the document text, as you can see, and then the classification decision. So this is after we applied those models. It looks like this was sort of classified as including an oppositional statement. We also are going to grab those likes, comments, and shares and just save them as numeric totals. And there's a whole bunch of posts, right? So we're going to do this for every single post from every single member of Congress across this time window. And it looks like this when we put it all in our studio. So here's one says Senate Republicans healthcare plan will kick millions. Well, that one ended up being rated as opposing Republicans, writing a bill in secret, oppose Republicans. And then we're going to sort of collapse all of those different posts together and just get one sort of percent score for each member. So it looks like about 21.3% of this member of Congress's posts expressed opposition to those in the other party. Okay, we're going to do that for all of the members of Congress. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of variation in this oppose any measure. Somebody like Robert Aderholt, it's pretty low. It's about 2% of all of his posts. Somebody like Tammy Baldwin is pretty high, 34%. Bob Brady, 40%. So we're going to do that for all the members of Congress. And then what? We want to sort of explain why members of Congress might be taking more oppositional stance. So we're going to examine where the average level of opposition is related to the ideological position of individual members of Congress. And to get a measure of ideological position, we just grabbed a measure called DW Nominate, which is available at voteview.com. And that's going to give an ideology score from very liberal to very conservative for every member of Congress based upon the way they voted on bills. Okay, so once we got those two variables of interest, let's put it in a ggplot. So we're going to say x-axis is going to be DW Nominate, y-axis is going to be that oppose any rate some nice little formatting stuff. And then we get this. So the ideological estimate goes from -1 to +1, very liberal to very conservative. That's the x-axis. Y-axis is the average share of posts for each member of Congress that expressed opposition. And as you can see, it looks like there's a pretty strong relationship between being further away from 0, i.e. being more liberal or more conservative, and expressing more opposition. We're going to make the graph look a little bit nicer in Adobe Illustrator, and then we're going to break it out by Congress. So we got the 114th Congress, got the 115th Congress. This is right after Trump was inaugurated. And then we also did support. I kind of skipped over that, but as you can see, there's sort of a similar pattern in opposition and in support. And maybe the biggest jump here is in the 115th Congress. Looks like the members of the Democratic Party were much more likely to express opposition overall. So what are all the moderates talking about? Well, if you remember, we also studied local issues, and it looks like members of Congress with more moderate ideological estimates are tending to talk a little bit more about local stuff. So this is just like, you know, I'm going to be having a town hall here, or congrats for doing this great job on this thing in the district, stuff like that. So that's sort of a big picture overview of these two kinds of rhetoric. And we can use this sort of fine-grained social media data to look over time. Basically, what this is showing here is that Democrats became much more likely to express political opposition in their posts after the election and then Trump's inauguration. And so yeah, one of the cool things about social media data is it really allows you to look at stuff in a fine-grained way. Okay, so takeaways from study 1. We imposed a constraint, looked at just members of Congress, and that helped us avoid bias and limit our data collection. Then we found that the most liberal and conservative lawmakers were expressing opposition more, and the opposition from Democrats increased after the 2016 election. All right, study 2, politics on Twitter. Now, in this one, we're going to start with a survey. And why would we want to do that? Well, a survey has a lot of virtues. It's representative. And so we're going to capture real people rather than bots or organizations. And that's going to allow us to look at a smaller number of people and then generalize to all US adults on Twitter. And the other really great thing about surveys is we can just ask for what we care about. So instead of having to infer, oh, is this person a Democrat or a Republican based on who they follow or what they're tweeting about, we can just say, are you a Democrat or a Republican? So that's pretty cool. And as I said, we can just look at a much smaller number of users rather than all of the US adults on Twitter. So, you know, we can start with some survey findings. Basically, we can say that on Twitter, people tend to be younger, they tend to be more highly educated, they tend to have higher incomes, they're more likely to be Democrats. That's all interesting, but that's, you know, you could just do a phone survey and get that information. It's not really linking the social media data with data that comes from individual respondents in a survey. So we want to understand how people use social media, and we suspect that they don't use it in a consistent way. It's also really, really hard to figure out how people use social media on a survey, right? Because if I asked you, how many times did you tweet in the last 6 months? You would probably struggle to answer that question just because it's really hard to remember. And, you know, how many people do you follow? I guess you could look it up, but maybe you wouldn't look it up. So surveys aren't great at gathering a lot of behavioral information related to social media use. So what we're going to do in the survey is ask people to share their Twitter handles with us, and then we'll collect the data separately. So we basically gave people this box that said we would like to understand the role of Twitter in society. And so people were pretty nice. They often offered their Twitter handles, about 75% did so. And then that lets us use the Twitter API. So with the Twitter API, we can get both basic information, like the number of tweets, saves, and follows about Twitter users, and more detailed information, like the actual tweets themselves from users with public accounts. And we found that 87% of US adults on Twitter had public accounts. Okay, so we're going to store this in a big database. We're using Django and Python to store all these tweets, but I think the next talk is focused on our tweet. Our tweet is a really, really nice intro to interacting with the Twitter API. Strongly recommend it. We've used it for other stuff. Okay, the other thing I wanted to note is that when you're analyzing social media data in R, when it's linked to surveys, there's a couple real advantages of R, and that's packages like Survey and Pew methods. And why are these important? Well, there's actually no Python package for estimating probability-based survey standard errors accurately. I think this is kind of wild, but the survey package in R, and then there's a tidyverse add-on called Surveyor, are super, super valuable because Python just can't quite do this. Okay, so once we gather the data, we're able to do things like this. We're able to say, let's look at the 10% most active tweeters. Of all the tweets in our data, how many came from that top 10%? It was 80%. So the top 10% of tweeters among US adults were generating 80% of the tweets. They favorited more stuff. They tweeted more, obviously. They had more followers. They had more following. So a lot more active overall. We can also look at who they follow. We can see that overall, about 1 in 5 US adults on Twitter follows Donald Trump. But we also were interested in how often people are actually discussing national politics. So again, we did sort of a machine classification project where we human coded a sample of 1,000 tweets. We built a simple model to detect political tweets in the full sample. And then we were able to say, how often do people tweet about national politics? Well, not very often. Only 13% of the tweets in our sample were about national politics. And of that 13%, 97% of them were generated by the most active 10% of users. So in other words, politics on Twitter, not that common. And this is a very strict sort of national politics definition. If you use a broader definition, there might be more, but it is increasingly a small number of people doing it. And then we're also, because we have the survey questions, able to break this out by age. And so as you can see, there's a lot more people age 18 to 49 who use Twitter and who produce a lot of tweets. When it comes to who's actually talking national politics, it tends to be those 50 and older. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So takeaways for study 2, it's nice to match a survey and a social media data source because then you have a representative window into how people use social media. We found that most US adults on Twitter don't talk politics, but a small minority loves to talk about it. And then older Americans use Twitter less, but they generate more of that political content. Okay, so to wrap up, at Pew Research Center, we created a blog. It's on Medium. There's a link to it there. And this is going to have a lot of really nice walkthroughs, both for the package we just released, Pew Methods, but also, general stuff about analyzing surveys in R. There's some stuff on machine classification, machine learning, all sorts of cool stuff. So please check it out. And thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Adam. That was amazing. We have time for one question, and I'm going to ask this first one. So when you're working with Facebook data, are you also distinguishing among different types of likes, like how you can choose a like option, love option, or surprise option?
Yeah, and I deleted that slide because I was a little tight on time, but we did break it up into all of the sort of emoji likes. And if you go to the report, there's a graph. Basically, if I remember right, we saw that the angry emoji jumped up a lot in responses to congressional tweets after the election. And I'm not sure if there were too many other changes. I think love sort of went up a little bit too. So anyway, check out the report. There's definitely an analysis of that. That was super fun to look at.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.